A bilateral relationship that's too crowded? On Saturday, June the 15th, Chinese Premier Li Qiang landed in Australia, the second leg of a three-nation tour, which includes New Zealand and Malaysia. His Australian counterpart Anthony Albanese said in an opinion piece on a major Australian newspaper that the visit signals, quote-unquote, another step forward in stabilizing bilateral relations. Now, ties plummeted after Canberra tagged along with the US in pushing the so-called China threat theory since 2018. To the point where Beijing stopped picking up its calls. But since Albanese came into office in May 2022, things have steadily improved, including trade relations that saw the lifting of restrictive measures by China on several Australian imports. There's also a positive change in public perception of China in Australia, albeit a slow one. Are the upward trends sustainable? Are we wiser in managing our differences? Has Australia found a way of navigating between its security alliance with the US and economic partnership with China? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. It's an opinion show that goes out 3 times a week. I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Roland Boer, an Australian scholar of Chinese philosophy and distinguished overseas professor at Renmin University of China. From Melbourne, Australia, by Dr. Hu Dan, Deputy Director of Australian Studies Centre at Beijing Foreign Studies University, and from Brisbane, Australia, by Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. The warmest welcome to all my guests. Let me go to Professor Boer first, or Roland, if I may. This is 7 months after Australian Prime Minister's visit to China, and it's also the first time by a Chinese premier in Australia in 7 years. Li Qiang said that bilateral relations have returned to the right track after twists and turns. So what exactly has changed over the last 2 years?
I'll put it this way, the lessons of the more recent history from 2018 seem to be have been learnt. It's on the right track, but there's still a long way to go. But I would add that there are actually lessons here from a longer history that goes back 50 years. This history begins with Gough Whitlam's visit and meeting Premier Li in the early 1970s, and you had a bipartisan agreement between the different political parties up until 2018 that developing closer economic ties with China and person-to-person changes was a good thing. So two sides, learning the lessons of the troubles, difficulties of the last few years up until the last 2, and then also the longer history.
Dr. Hu, what is your understanding of what has changed over the past 2 years? And is this rapprochement on a more solid footing now?
I definitely agree with Roland that, as he said, a lot of things changed since Labour and Albanese took office in May 2022 after the last federal election. And as widely anticipated, Labour revised its China policy as it was talking about during the campaign. And I would define Labour's new China policy as more pragmatic and more diplomatic. So that's why later on, when we see intentions of both sides to improve relations, things got back on track. And I guess from a Chinese scholar's perspective, I think the biggest lesson from this frost for particularly the Canberra side is that for a very long time in Canberra, there was this myth that security and politics can be separated from economics. So a lot of Australian scholars or think tank people would say that business will be as usual, no matter what Australia does on the strategic security front. And I guess the lesson from the past few years, since arguably late 2017, is that this separation doesn't work, and it's a package deal.
Well, some media are putting it this way. For instance, The Economist says Li Qiang and China look to make up with Australia. The onus, it seems, that is on China to mend ties. Warwick, is this a one-sided affair? What is your take?
I often describe the relationship between China and Australia as a bilateral relationship with trilateral characteristics, which of course adds an element of complexity to how two countries deal with each other. The fact of the matter is, the economic interests in particular of both countries are served by the countries working together. And I think we've seen some of that emerge as a recognition of reality over the last few years. The other thing that I think has dawned on everybody concerned is that by being able to work with each other and engage with each other through more traditional forms of statecraft, with diplomatic language and using diplomatic channels, that the countries can make a respective and relative contribution to regional stability and peace. So relationships that involve parties always require both parties to come to the table.
Right. Well, some people in Australia or elsewhere in the West who read a lot about Western perspective when it comes to China would ask, what about China? Has China done nothing wrong? What about the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy that has actually made matters worse when you react very sharply to accusations or smearing in your perspective? Dr. Hu, how would you look at on the part of China? Has China also become wiser or more experienced in dealing with some of the noises that may hurt bilateral relations?
Definitely. And I think I just would like to add one more dimension to what you were talking about just now. A lot of the misperceptions about wolf warriors. A part of it is really about translation and this kind of very nuanced difference between Chinese language and also there's a transcultural rendition of a message. So back to the diplomacy part, I think that's really something that both sides have learned. And I think that on the Chinese side, it's also adjusting the way that it's trying to address some of the differences, for example, when it comes to Australia. So back to what we were talking about in 2017 and 2018, so both sides found that messaging is really something very important in bilateral relations.
And China was, reacting very strongly, pushing back very strongly what it perceives to be unfounded accusations, hence probably earning this unwarranted title of wolf warrior. Well, that page is hopefully gone. And I want to come to the fundamentals of the different ways that countries approach international relation, because I think that is fundamental in making a relationship more solid and more sustainable. I mean, that we can learn from the mistakes. And I try to look at it from a civilizational point of view or a cultural point of view, because there seems to be different understanding as how countries should deal with each other. Some argue that, we look at interests and national interests alone, whereas in China, it seems there's a deeper understanding and from a more historical perspective. And here I want to go to Roland, because you're a professor of philosophy, which is very much needed, I think, when we look at international relations in this day and age. And in Chinese traditional culture, allow me to quote this poem from the Chinese Book of Odes. It describes a friendship. Probably you can even help us understand that in Chinese, but I'm going to do the English translation. It says, "There was presented to me a papaya, and I returned for it a beautiful jade. Not as a return for it, but that our friendship might be lasting." So how do China, on this civilizational basis, approach relations between countries, as a semblance of relations between two persons? And how does that affect our understanding of how countries should deal with each other on the long run?
Well, I might begin by answering that the quotation from the Book of Odes continues with the next is a peach, and then in return it's precious jade, and with the same following, not as a return for it, but for the sake of lasting friendship, and then a plum, and then black jade.
What does it say, though? Yeah, what in essence does it want to tell us?
Well, if we look at it, obviously there's quite a discrepancy between a papaya, a peach, and a plum, and precious, fine, or black jade. There's quite a discrepancy between the two. The point of it is, well, maybe I can put it historically this way. There's a saying that when Chinese ships set out, famously following the monsoonal cycles, they were treasure ships, in the sense that they had gifts which were wanted to be given to places where they landed. There's some, at least they landed in what's now known as Indonesia. Some suggest even in northern Australia. When European imperialist powers are first beginning to send their ships out, their trading vessels were also gunboats. And that signals quite a significant difference in approach to how these things have developed historically. Also, another aspect of this, we need to think about short-term and long-term. Short-term and long-term. And the verses from the Book of Odes indicate that the gifts themselves might be an immediate process of a gift giving, which is very, very important, actually, in many cultures. But the point of it is that it's actually seen to be a long-term friendship, a long-term relationship. And that's what comes through for me. The discrepancy is initially an interesting one to catch your attention, but the big emphasis is lasting friendship, lasting friendship. And one of the things that strikes me very much about the Chinese cultural and philosophical tradition is there is a great sensibility of the immediate, but especially the long term, how that works out.
Dr. Hu, do you think that matters here? Because my fear is, okay, right now our relationships are better, are improving. A lot of people may approach this from a pure economic point of view. Okay, Australia is going to be able to sell more to China. But if you just look at it from that perspective, is this going to be a long-term solution, a long-term friendship eventually?
The first thing I want to note is that this is definitely, I mean, the kind of a long-term friendship is definitely what both sides want to achieve and want to drive, and that's very clear. And just based on what I was talking about the business interests and business as usual sentiment on the Australian side, and I would just say that economic concerns or considerations are definitely important because there has been huge pressure on Australia's economy, and Australia just didn't want to break the record of consecutively 28 years of economic growth. And the next federal election is in next May, the latest. So there's definitely huge pressure there. But then I think, as what we can see is that the fundamentals in bilateral relations haven't changed. And the kind of geopolitical dilemma and challenges facing Australia will not change. So that's why, and I think the Australian government and a lot of the public know about it, that this is something that they need to fix, they need to figure out sooner or later.
Warwick, do you think the Australian leadership and the Australian public have figured it out under the influence of the Australian press how to deal with China? Because I see in the press, China is, again, often reduced to stereotypes, either the panda or the dragon, depending on the mood of the day. And I have the impression that the average Australians are pretty much led by what the press are saying about this country. So do you think there has been a better understanding of what China really is and how to deal with China?
There are actually concerns that over the course of the last 20 years or so that Australia's overall, quote, China literacy has declined somewhat. There was a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s where a strong emphasis was given through the Australian education system to raising the knowledge across the Australian community, particularly through schools and universities of Asia in general and China in particular. That, however, has diminished over the course of the last 20 years, and perhaps we've seen the relationship reduced a little bit too much to an economic transactional one. I think the issue that you touched on before, by reference to the Book of Odes, actually opens up a much broader question about how countries and people think about relationships. And what we're starting to see is China reach into its past to mobilize philosophical tools to navigate its position as a great power again and how it relates to others. And in doing so, it sees its relationships with others as being entangled, where China can't be who China is without its interactions and relationships with others that are deep and persistent. So these point to an approach, if you will, Lucian, that emphasizes entanglement and mutual coexistence. One can't exist without the other, and we need to mature the thinking beyond mere transactional terms.
Absolutely. Do you think, Warwick, I'm going to stay with you, do you think Australia has found a way to do exactly that, or to approach this relationship more maturely? Because, for instance, in terms of Australia's approach to China, Albanese's mantra is to, quote unquote, cooperate with China where we can, disagree where we must, and engage our national interest. How should we understand, and how is that difference between this and the US's approach, which is to compete with confidence, cooperate where we can, and contest where we must?
First things first, the contrast with the American formula is quite clear. The American formula emphasizes competition and contest, and you don't find those two words in the Australian formulation. And
no.
I think that speaks
and
to...
you have the engage word.
They do have the engage word. And I think the Australian formulation is mindful of a couple of things. One is that Australia is a smaller nation and does not operate on the world stage as a superpower. It also doesn't, as a result of that, necessarily have a sense that it is in a contest with other nations. Australia has historically been a trading country and understands the importance of being able to interact with others, even if it is purely on transactional terms. So the sense of engagement coming from the Australian side, I think, is somewhat different from the US. The other thing too, as to your broader question, is that I think Australia is still, like China, post the pandemic, rediscovering a way of engaging with the world and calibrating the way that it engages both at a bilateral level but also at a multilateral level. And from an Australian perspective, sitting here in Brisbane, I'm watching a country that is firstly seeking to place a floor underneath the what seemed only 2 or 3 years ago as a bottomless pit in decline in tone and attitude, at least with a floor that enables the progressive explorations of new ways of engagement.
Boer, are you more hopeful that now that we have come out of a period of turbulence and twists and turns, are you more hopeful that the Australian people start to make some better understanding about China? Because we are seeing some poll numbers, if they are to be trusted, for instance, that 60% of Australians believe that Australia should have a strong relationship with China, but also we're seeing 64% of people express concerns about Australia's relationship with China. So there is a slight improvement over the COVID years, over the past few years, but still the change is a very slow one.
Maybe I'll begin with a small comment on that interesting formula from Albanese, but also which is used by Penny Wong, the foreign minister. It seems to me that it's an Australian version of a very commonly used Chinese phrase, which is finding areas of common ground and putting aside differences, and the differences to be dealt with later. It's closer to a Chinese approach than it is to a US approach. That interesting bifurcation on those figures with the polls indicates what we can see historically is that in the past, say with the UK and then after the Second World War with the US, the military ties and political ties are also connected with economic ties. But there's been a bifurcation over the last few decades, and the economic ties with China have grown, whereas the military and political ties have diverged. And it's that, you call it a contradiction if you like, we can use that approach to understand that development. But I'd like to add a third point here. It's a demographic question since the 1970s. I often tell people this in different parts. So the first language spoken at home in Australia, English is declining. And 3 years ago on the census, it was 72%. It's less than that now. The second most spoken language by far is Chinese. Now, this is Mandarin, Cantonese, and so on. Statistics from 3 years ago indicate 4%, or about 1 million out of a population of 25 million, and that does not include people who speak a Chinese language or a dialect as a second language. That has significant implications for the demographics, also for the sense of Australian identity, and you can add other languages also from Southern Asia and Southeast Asia into that.
So does that mean that this is going to add positive momentum to our relationship in the long run?
I would hope so. I think there'll be still some twists and turns, but I would hope so. If you have 1 million or more Australians with deep connections, family ties, and so on, and cultural assumptions that shape the way in which Australia moves forward, I would see that as having a positive influence.
Well, at the same time, Australia is also maintains a very strong tie with the United States. They use second to none, very good very close relationship. After all, it's a relationship that's it's an alliance that's tested by wartime comradeship, if I can put it this way, between Australians and the United States and other Western countries. So, Dr. Hu, do you think Australia has found a way to navigate between its military alliance, its security alliance with the United States, being part of the Five Eyes, for instance, being part of the Quad, being part of the AUKUS, and its economic partnership and its demographic entanglement with Chinese?
I actually think this will be the biggest geopolitical and diplomatic challenge for Australia in at least the next 10 to 20 years. If what we have seen with, for example, what happens with America and China is secure to stay, then for Australia, that challenge will be huge. And what I have seen during the past 2 years is that the Labor government has found a way to more diplomatically and pragmatically address the relations with China, but then the fundamentals are still there. So how to navigate that will definitely, I would say it has been and will remain a very important topic in the public debate in Australia.
Roland, what is your take on this? Because likely the pressure will be sustained, if not greater, from the United States for Australia to be on its sides. Although China is not demanding that Australia withdraw from AUKUS, from the Five Eyes, nor has China demanded that New Zealand withdraw from the Five Eyes, and China is actually on pretty good relationship with New Zealand.
Well, let's begin with the Australia-New Zealand comparison. This is an old relationship that goes back across the ditch, as we call it. And it's competitive, but also very close. My perspective on this is I think that Australia can learn much, and I think has learned much from New Zealand's approach to all of this. So that's the first point I'd like to make here. The second point actually is very important, and I note I haven't been following it closely, but the discussion is beginning in Australia that it's widely agreed by analysts that US power is declining rapidly. Its influence around the globe is slipping significantly. Economically, it's falling further and further behind. Now, what are the implications for that about Australia's security or military agreements with the US? Will it find a way, like New Zealand, to take a more independent approach, still be part of some of these organisations which keep coming and going, I would add? That's the big question and again, shorter term and longer term, 10, 20, 50 years. What happens to Australia when the US is no longer the power that it has been? And that process is obvious to many, many observers now.
Okay. Well, Warwick, let me go to you on this very important question, because the so-called Security Alliance, I understand, is using China as the imagined target, that because of China's growing influence in the region. So these countries need to bond together to counter the rising so-called China threat. Is there really a dichotomy between security and economic interest for a country such as Australia? Because I don't understand how they figure in the South China Sea issue, for instance, and China doesn't see Australia as a potential target for prey.
Look, this question, although a bifurcation of security and economic interests, has been part and parcel of a particular way of thinking about international relations, which derives from the realist school, which suggests that push comes to shove, a nation will choose security or survival ahead of prosperity. So it pits these two questions as an either-or. I think a more sophisticated approach is actually one that treats these as holistic pieces of a complex set of interrelationships. You can't have prosperity without security, and you can't have security without prosperity. Now, reaching that conclusion and then thinking through what that means from a practical point of view, in many respects is exactly where Australia is at in its relationships with China and with Asia. As the previous guest mentioned, it is widely believed now that the relative power of the United States has been declining within the region. What's happening at this stage is that the US is working very, very hard to either reassert primacy in the region or maintain what primacy it has. That is going to put pressure on sub-imperial allies like Australia or former colonies or client states. Now, Australia's attitudes, I suspect, will evolve as time goes by, and Australia, I think, will continue to adopt a tried and true Australian approach to this dilemma, which is to, and I'll use an Australian turn of phrase here, to kick the can down the road and hope that time will work its magic. So in the meantime, hopefully the relationships delivers the kinds of benefits that can take place through exchange, and the thorny problems will, let time deal with those.
Sure. Well, I think that's probably the only way that things are going to work. And by the way, China is not forcing Australia to choose sides at this moment. China didn't force New Zealand to choose side either, which is often not the case when it comes to what countries ask China to do, Anyway, a very quick question, 20-second, I'm going to give to Roland, because the signal for Doctor Who is not too good. Is Australia possibly receiving the visa-free policy from China as well? And what would that be? 20 seconds. What's your prediction?
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
I think it would be a very good signal. There are many, many people in Australia who would love to be able to travel to China and vice versa on a visa-free agreement. So I'm certainly hoping so. The signals are good. But we have to wait for an announcement.
Yeah, fingers crossed. No, let people come and see, and things will develop naturally, as we say in traditional Chinese philosophy. Many thanks to Roland Boer from Renmin University of China, Dr. Hu Dan from Beijing Foreign Studies University, and Warwick Powell from Queensland University of Technology. Thank you very much. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, as always. You can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching.